Hello, today we're going to talk about the civil rights movement gains momentum. In the 1950s, segregation was still going on. African Americans had different public restrooms, drinking fountains, churches, parks. Any African American that broke segregation rules could be arrested or put actually in jail. And that's if the cops got to them first. If you had your white supremacists that got to them first, they might beat them, bomb their house. Just a bunch of horrible stuff could have happened to any African American that broke segregation laws. And not much happened to those white people that attacked the African American people. Because all of the juries at the time were white, right? It's not like now where you have a jury of your peers, where you have a mixed jury. Back then it was all white people. So white people weren't going to convict another white person of bombing an African American's house. It just wasn't going to happen. And the rules that would change that stuff, they were voted on. But not by the African American community because they didn't have the right to vote. Because they couldn't change the policies to give them the right to vote. So it was nothing was getting changed because as much as the African American community wanted to change, it wasn't going to change because white people had put in so many barriers for them to actually vote that they couldn't vote. So this was just a very hard time in the South. And the civil rights movement was moving, but what really set the civil rights movement off was Rosa Parks. Right? Rosa Parks was a member of the NAACP. I said right that time. And in December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks was getting off her job. She got on a bus. She actually sat in the fifth row, which was the first row of the segregation part of the bus. So she was actually in the right section, but a white guy got on the bus, all the white seats were taken, and he wanted her seat. She said, no, I'm not gonna do it. This led to her getting arrested, and she was fined $10, which doesn't seem like a lot now, but back in the day, it was quite a bit of money. And all this happened just because she wanted to give up her seat to a white man because he wanted it. And she said about this, or she said later on about it, she said, I was not tired physically, I was tired of giving in. So she just said, no, I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm going to sit here. You can arrest me. Even the bus driver said, we're going to arrest you. She said, if you're going to, go ahead. All right. And this sparked a movement that I don't think anybody, or a revolution, and gave the civil rights more momentum, and which led to the Montgomery bus boycott. Right? This was led by Martin Luther King Jr. and another guy, I think his name is Abernathy. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing it. I'll write the real name down at the bottom. Martin Luther King learned from Benjamin Mays nonviolent protests. So that was Martin Luther King Jr.'s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s whole thing was nonviolent protests. And he and Abernathy, I believe his name was, they set up the Montgomery bus boycott. So 4 days after Rosa Parks was arrested and fined, so on December 5th, 1955, the Montgomery Improvement Association staged the Montgomery bus boycott. And they demanded, I want to read this to make sure I get it right, they demanded segregation on buses and that African American riders be treated with respect and dignity, and that African Americans be hired to drive mostly predominantly African American bus routes. All right? That's all they wanted. They just want to be treated fairly and hired for jobs. That's not really much to ask for. But 99% of the African American population in Montgomery actually participated in this, in the bus boycott. They walked miles and miles to get to their job, to and from. They had carpools. They set up a wagon route. I don't even know what that is. I assume they just had wagons that they were riding around in. The bus company lost thousands of dollars in revenue, which doesn't seem like a lot now, but back then it was a lot of money. And that's just amazing that Rosa Parks, one woman just didn't want to give a receipt, led to 99% of a population getting behind something that made their lives difficult. Walking miles and miles to work, working all day, and then walking miles back is not fun, but they all did it because they believed in something. Dr. King was arrested and his house was actually bombed, but he continued his nonviolent protest. After his house was bombed, I mean, he could have lost it and went seeking revenge. He didn't. He said, basically, if I'm arrested or if I'm killed, someone's just going to step in my place and keep on this nonviolent protest. And what this all did was it helped fuel nonviolent protests. Right? They saw once in November 16th, 1956, the Supreme Court said that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. So with that result, it showed that nonviolent protests could work and that they could get through. So this bus boycott kind of shifted it, kept the momentum going, and it led to the SCLC being established. So this was a big organization. It's the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It's headquartered in Atlanta because that was a large middle-class African-American community in Atlanta. It was established on January 1957, and Martin Luther King Jr. was the president of this organization. It was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. And there's some of their main things that they did. They encouraged and support nonviolent protest movement. That's mostly what it was, is they wanted to support nonviolent protests. You had other people at this time that went the other way with the violence, but they didn't want to do it. They did sit-ins. The big one of their first things was at the Atlanta Magnolia Tea Room. Their sit-in. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested. Some other things they did is they filed lawsuits against the government over segregation and discrimination. They held voter drives to get the African American community registered to vote. They planned desegregation initiatives. I think that's what that says. I have bad handwriting. They organized marches and rallies. So the civil rights was going. You had Plessy versus Ferguson a long time ago. Then you had Brown versus the Board of Education that got rid of segregation, but you had the South trying to hold on to it. Then you have this one lady sit on a bus, not give it up, and it's just started the revolution of the civil rights movement. And establishing the SCLC was a big deal in that. All right, this has been the civil rights movement gains momentum. Hope it helps.